Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's really a great pleasure to be here. I come by way of the federal government, but I come to the federal government by way of that urban black box, King County, Washington, which is a regional government up in the Seattle area. And I was the Deputy Chief of Staff for the now Deputy Secretary of HUD there, and we did a lot of work on climate change, which I'm going to talk to you about. One of the things we did was to come here to Arizona State, and we sat through the decision. They have a decision facility here, which is really quite remarkable, and we learned a lot about the materials and the designs, the resilient materials that you are producing, much of which is on the cutting edge of technology. So it's great to be back. I'm going to begin my story today back in King County, long before I got there, back in 1988. Then King County Council member Ron Sims, my current boss, and a fellow named Bruce Lang got interested in this thing called climate change, and they put forth some legislation. And it's up on the board now, and you might read it, talking about creating an Office of Climate Change, of all things, back in 1988. It was interesting. They proposed in this legislation $100,000 to fund 2 positions for none other than a couple of scientists to help study and learn about this phenomenon. But a funny thing happened on the way to getting this legislation passed. If the greenhouse gas effect is exacerbated by the political hot air, the world is in real trouble. The hyperbolic clouds of rhetorical gas belched out on this issue in recent weeks could easily choke someone, or at least cloud the vision of otherwise rational people. If Sims and Lang want to study the greenhouse gas effect, they should buy themselves some tomato plants and a bag of steer manure, which shouldn't be at all, and this is my favorite part, for such experienced politicians to find. Suffice to say, that legislation back in 1988 did not pass. You know, they were kind of ridiculed. I mean, the language is great. You can't really make that up. I mean, but that's a fact. Well, Ron persevered on many fronts. He eventually became the King County executive, and through various policies, which I'll talk about briefly, both mitigation and adaptation and other ecological and environmental urbanization strategies. In 2006, as we talked about the story a little bit, it was kind of a nice postscript. They wrote a nice piece talking about how leadership really has made a difference. I like to talk about that story for a few reasons. First, I mean, the language is great. But second, leadership is hard. It's hard. And when we talk about how institutions play a role and how institutions, both locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally, we need to dissect how they operate, leadership at all levels can't be ignored. And it may be easier to talk about these issues now, but there is always a constant demand on resources. And how to organize an agenda and move it forward will always be a challenge. The second reason I like to talk about that is you kind of take your leaders where they are in this black box of urbanization. These were 2 county council members who showed dramatic initiative at a time when not a lot of folks knew about this issue. There are leaders, and one of the things that I've discovered in my learnings is that leaders are everywhere, and you have to go out and support them where they are. There are examples of folks, many, many examples, who have no actual authority at all of moving agendas. And lastly, I love to talk about that because it involves science and the role science plays in policymaking and how important it is to embrace science and those translation functions, individuals and institutions that translate science to policy to create these agendas. So how did we do it? How did they do it? what's the paradigm? One thing that we did was simply ask the climate question. It's a very straightforward proposition. To address environmental issues in an urban environment, you have to embed the question at all levels of government. We literally went around asking each department, each discipline, the climate question. And that simply means, how are you incorporating those information that are already hardwired into the decisions we make? Because I got to tell you, they're already there. The 100-year flood plan, wastewater projections are all there. Science and climate are behind them. How are we asking the climate question and testing those assumptions in our policies and policy making? And in asking those questions, there are several things, as you bring meaning to asking those questions, that I would like to tell you today. First, you got to think on the margin. One of the key initiatives, billion-dollar urban initiatives, infrastructure initiatives that Ron addressed, was the need to create a new wastewater system. The driving force behind this decision was clearly population and other immediately relevant issues. However, we asked the climate question and came up with a marginal investment for a reclaimed water system while the pipes were open, where the marginal cost of building this backbone for reclaimed water would be dramatically less than having to open it up again in the future. We knew, based on downscaled climate science, now these are assumptions. You don't get certainty. You have to deal with probabilities. But we had a building blocks document that talked about the likelihood of warmer, wetter winters, of flooding, of drought, seasonal drought. And there were other issues. So when you think on the margin, local governments and urban institutions are making decisions every single day. The question is, how do you ask the climate question and add a marginal consideration, knowing what we know about projected changes in climate, to make a policy decision? Now, if you play that out, you'll then ask, what's the win-win scenario? You'll take the marginal cost of the adaptive action and you'll put it up against the likelihood or probability of the change in climate. But you'll begin to have a sophisticated, forward-thinking conversation about building climate science and adaptation into your decision-making process. But it's not just enough to think on the margin. You have to speak to people's interests. When you get inside the black box, and I have notes, I thought the introduction was dead spot on. You have to speak to people's interests. It's not just about climate. When we had, in our regional government, when we had stresses to our levee system, and we realized the way we funded to pay for those stresses was a balkanized, limited funding source, geographically limited. We discovered that much of the consequence of those levees failing would likely cause significant, if not irreparable, economic harm to the region, because it was in a low-lying area where a lot of industry moved in to move transportation, food systems, and the like, probably because the land was cheaper. So when we went to change the way we raise money to pay for and fix the levees, our narrative became profoundly about economics, buttressed by our scientists talking about the stresses that would likely come to the levees. And the third point is to think across disciplines. Inside the urbanization and the integration of the environmental and adaptive agenda, you discover first, on the first day of moving policies forward, how interdisciplinary the work is. One of the first things I did was to form an interdisciplinary group where our wastewater folks sat in the same room as our transportation folks that sat in the same room as our solid waste people. because all of them we knew would play a profound role in what strategies, what levers of change at the local government we knew we controlled, and we wanted to make sure that we included the diversity of those ideas in our policy making. It is no surprise then when the Deputy Secretary went to Washington, D.C. to join up with our Secretary, Sean Donovan, at the request of the President. One of the first projects we worked on was building an interagency partnership. You may have heard of the HUD-DOT-EPA partnership, the livability partnership formed around these 6 principles which we collaborated on and wrote to knit together how housing and transportation and environmental planning work across federal agencies. It became, in many ways, a signature initiative to think broadly about health outcomes and environmental outcomes and transportation and housing and economic outcomes across the agencies. And we put up these principles and followed these principles as we created policy. And in doing so, as we arrived, our Secretary had already kicked off a Sustainable Communities Initiative inside of HUD. Now this became the focal point inside our institution, not only to think about housing and transportation and the environment, but to think about how to connect across all other agencies and coordinate those policies. And we asked and we received in 2010 real money to do it. Now these aren't billions of dollars, but these dollars have proven to have an effect disproportionate to their size, because the appetite and demand for the use of these funds, and these are for the most part planning dollars, competitive planning dollars that communities across our country, regional focused for the most part for the 100 million, we have put these resources out for folks to think differently, to fund the thinking, the planning across the disciplines necessary to integrate water and transportation and greenhouse gas reduction strategies. And a funny thing happened as we went through this process. You can't read all that language. I didn't put it up there for you to read it. But take my word for it. That's all about climate change adaptation, because we wrote most of it. And I don't know how many other, or if there are other, grant applications that specifically give points and allow for funds to be used to characterize threats to the environment, human health, or property associated with expected changes, sea level rise, storm surge, lack of water supply, more intense rainfall, events resulting in water pollution as examples. This language is in the funding. As these communities grow and plan, we are actually providing the resources necessary to do that planning work. So the third lesson learned as we move to the federal level, and I think part of the insight I hope to provide today is having conducted plans and implemented projects on the local level and now the federal level to give you some insight as to how all of this works at different scales. Well, this is the federal scale, and this is in combination with our federal partners. And it's a small step, but it is a powerful step to integrate and ask the climate question as we move forward. 2 minutes. So asking the climate question now, as yesterday the White House unveiled another interagency collaboration we've been working on, has evolved, and this is my characterization of it, into a flexible framework that we wrote. There's a group of agencies, many of us, joining with the Council for Environmental Quality to make recommendations to the President on climate change adaptation. And this is what I would consider to be, again, my characterization, the evolution of asking the climate question. It's a series of questions that we hope federal governments now will ask at all scales, from the project level to the agency level, and we hope that this will build a dialogue, an interagency dialogue, to help prioritize and implement actions associated with our changing climate. The report itself is now available. I can provide links to it, the recommendations. Again, it's very timely. It's one of the reasons why I was very excited to come today to speak to you. It's been a lot of work. We think we started in the fall of 2009. It's very comprehensive, and it's specific to the United States. However, Goal 4 is to enhance efforts to lead and support international adaptation, to develop government-wide strategies to support multilateral and bilateral adaptation activities and integrate adaptation into relevant U.S. foreign assistance programs, and so on. And as we move forward with next steps of these recommendations, we hope to see and grow these ideas working with both our domestic and international partners. So, as we move, for next steps, I'm eager to make the recommendations available to all of you and to close the loop on how optimistic, and I like that term, forward-thinking, recognizing that today we have an opportunity to link and knit together from the local perspective where I come from through to the federal perspective. And in that spirit, I would like to close my presentation by quoting not an economist, a politician, a poet, or a policymaker, but rather William Shakespeare, which is somewhat ironic because much of William Shakespeare goes right by me. But this quote I get. There is a tide in the affairs of men, people, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted all the voyage of their life, is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea, we are now afloat, and we must take the current where it serves, or lose our ventures. I love this quote. It is quite literally the rising tide we face. But figuratively, I think it's about opportunity. Opportunity taken and opportunity missed. And I understand that as this conference moves forward, you will be discussing challenges. And rightly we should. But there is also this moment in time where we can come together, assess the collective stresses that we need to face, and find ways through local, state, federal, and international initiatives to give birth to new innovation, new ideas, new initiatives to make this world a better, healthier, safer place to live. So thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much. This was a very great introduction of our session. And I would allow for two quick questions to Mr. James as he's leaving almost before the end of this session. So the floor is open for two questions, brief questions. Yeah, the microphone is just up front. Please introduce yourself and ask.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Harriet Buckley, Durham University. You said that you asked the climate question. I was wondering, did anybody listen? Who were they? And if they didn't, how did you get anything done? Thank you.
You know, I think it's an African proverb that says, he who asks questions cannot avoid the answers. No. So it isn't. I have it as one. If you keep asking, folks will listen because, but by sheer persistence, I think the challenges present themselves. But I think part of the thesis of what my message is today is, you have to ask the questions, but moving forward on policy and agenda requires a very sophisticated approach to how policy moves. So when you ask the climate question, you have to act in the context of the kind of political and policy realities that we face. And that's where this marginal thinking, and that's where speaking in economic terms to solve ecological problems, I think needs to be part of the discourse that we talk about. I think climate and adaptation become a criteria, a very important criterion as to how we articulate what it is we need to do, but we have to be cognizant. My thesis is you have to be cognizant of how policy gets done. And oftentimes it is when you ask the climate question, it raises the issue to be considered. But the answer to how you're going to solve or meet or take advantage of an opportunity often depends on traditional ways by which people act, and that is to speak to their interests and to make sure that you're characterizing your agenda in such a way that is acceptable to folks not particularly or necessarily concerned with the climate.
Thank you. If there is not other questions, we welcome Dr. Aromar from India to give a presentation. Yeah? Just one more? Okay, last one.
Yeah, I'm just curious, having worked at different scales in terms of, in different political sort of arenas, I'm curious if you can kind of give us a sense of whether or not you think these issues of climate change should be kind of addressed at local or kind of citywide or regional or national scales, and kind of it's an ecological project, it's an ecological problem, but it's solved or addressed through kind of economic means. So is there a particular scale that you think might be more or less effective, and do you see that evolving as people learn more about this and embrace these kind of concerns over time?
You know, it's a great question, and our kind of call to action from local government was aim, fire, ready. Action. There's this kind of nobility to action. So my preference is to do things at any scale, and because climate change impacts happen locally, usually it's the local folks that act first. But you can't really do this without knitting all levels of government, I think, and institutions, public, private, and the NGO community. So I think part of the responsibility incumbent for folks like me and others is to make sure that we're doing what we can to provide an environment where all those activities can be knitted together. And I think part of what we're doing with this report and these recommendations is to create that environment. That is the hope.
Excellent. So thank you. Aromar, please. Thank you very much.